Good morning. Could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your nonprofit origin story?
Yeah, thank you for having me, by the way, for this conversation. I'm so excited for any opportunity to talk to you. But my name is Mallory Erickson, and I have spent my entire career in the nonprofit sector and really like my whole life. I started volunteering, I think, when I was like 6 or 8 years old. When my family came to this country, they were supported by local nonprofits. And I've always like investing in nonprofits and participating is just like a big part of my DNA. And then I started in an education nonprofit in a teaching fellowship program organization called Citizen Schools. That was my first like official job, although I did plenty of summer interning
I love it.
to let me file things in their offices, and became an accidental fundraiser like so many people do as I was getting promoted up through different positions that then came with big fundraising responsibilities. And so found myself in fundraising roles, but never called myself a fundraiser because of my own like discomfort with fundraising and my own limiting beliefs about money and investment in organizations and maybe even our organization's worth. And so had like maybe a part of my burnout story in nonprofit was also a little bit of an identity crisis. I just really couldn't figure out how to make nonprofit leaderships feel sustainable and for fundraising to feel not just good, okay, to not make me
Yeah.
want to throw up every time I was going to talk to a donor. And yeah, that really led to my own kind of personal breakdown and breakthrough. And I ended up, while I was in a nonprofit leadership role, having the opportunity to get certified as an executive coach, trained in habit and behavior design and design thinking. None of that was connected to my fundraising at the time. It was through the sort of education components that I was leading for the organization. But those frameworks really came together and totally changed how I approached fundraising, how I felt about fundraising, in addition to all the like leadership implications that it had as well, because those frameworks are just so helpful in understanding your own behavior and the behavior of people around you and being able to grow and change into the fundraiser or the leader that you want to be. So that's my whole life is my
I love
nonprofit
that.
origin story.
I love that. And you've worked now through your work in nonprofit, but also these companies you've built after the fact, these communities. What I find so fascinating is fundraisers come in, there's like generational fundraisers, almost like yourself, right? This is part of the DNA of their entire families. There is equally or sometimes more people that end up in this sector on the most like meandering, hilarious paths of this was never the plan, but
Mm,
they're here now. Anecdotally, what would you say in terms of what you learned with this design thinking and behavior? Do
mm,
people come in more prepared for nonprofit when they've actually had more exposure to it? Or do you think that comes in with a whole bunch of like
mm,
background assumptions?
mm. Yeah. Did you say the word prepared?
I did say the word prepared.
I think I was trying to like track. I've never thought about this before, but probably people who have had some previous experience in nonprofits are better prepared in certain ways for what to expect. But are they prepared for success in the same ways? I don't know. And part of that, I think, is what you're alluding to, which is we have all these limiting beliefs that surround the sector. We have stigmas and scarcity mindset that's really embedded structurally in
Yeah.
the sector that then infiltrates our brain and our body. And that I feel like a lot of the work that I do today, honestly, is helping people unwind that, take those things out. So I think for some folks who show up in the sector from uncommon pathways and don't have those mental models, I think they really help push us forward because they come in like, wait, but why is it this way? And we're
Yeah.
like, "Well, just this is how it is." And so sometimes I think folks come from outside the sector with patronizing and ways of showing up and pretending like they know more than the people who have been building that organization or in that community. And I'm not endorsing any of that. I think community knowledge and organizational knowledge and grassroots on the ground knowledge is so critical and so important. And I think there's a lot of curiosity that we could invite in when we have friends and folks and coworkers who are new to this space.
Yeah. It's been so interesting because we've actually had a decent number of people joining the nonprofit, and they always check with me first, which I love because they'll literally say, I'm really interested in working in this sector. can I just talk to other people who are in the sector and ask those questions? I'm like, hey, if you're coming in and that's the angle you're coming in at, love it. I would maybe say that when you start your conversation with somebody that this is what you're looking for. But it is a really cool sector. I think there are more and more people who are seeing it as this is a place where I can find purpose. A lot of
Mm,
workplaces don't necessarily have that feeling of purpose, and we're all looking for that more. But you're so right. I see a lot of people who the assumptions about how nonprofit has to work are really deeply dug in for
mm,
many of us. And how do we shake loose from that? And sometimes it's that new, fresh group
mm.
coming in has
Yeah,
different
you know what? It
ideas.
makes me uncomfortable. I think that was like some of my biggest learning in bringing in people to organizations that I worked at, or even now in my day to day, is just because something makes you uncomfortable doesn't mean it's wrong and doesn't mean those aren't conversations we should be having. And so when those new voices come in and it makes us really uncomfortable, we like shut it down. I think that's where we lose the opportunity to actually just get curious together and be like, yeah, change is uncomfortable. So that's okay.
It is uncomfortable for sure. Okay. So I always love to ask people what their favorite part of working in the nonprofit sector is.
I think you just said it, honestly, in terms of why people want to be here. I think getting to wake up every day and feel like you get to live out your values and the things that you care about the most in the world, the worries that I would have about the world, to feel like I was doing everything I could to change those things. That is such a gift that I think I really took for granted a lot, what it means to get to live a life like that. And then also just being surrounded by people I'm values aligned with. And I think having my whole career in the nonprofit sector, that's also something I take for granted and sometimes have to step out when, or hear my husband tell a story and I'm like, wait, you guys aren't aligned. You're not aligned with the people you work with on that core value or belief. And it like rocks me a little bit, because I feel like in the nonprofit sector, I just didn't really like, not that I loved every single person I ever worked with or every boss. I had plenty of toxic nonprofit stories I could tell you, but I never felt like fundamentally misaligned on beliefs, perhaps related to how the world functions.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's probably pretty special, and again, I don't think many people in nonprofits see this in the same way. And I think it's been more since I got into a startup and I'm meeting all these other people who they're in startup mode. And so obviously these are passionate people as well, and they've got deep purpose for what they're doing. But it's somehow still different than the people I meet who are in the nonprofit space of where their purpose is, how they see the world, how they view what could be better, what could be done. It's just there's this like slight shift to all of how nonprofiteers come into the space. And we come in with very different lived experiences, and that's like probably our strength,
Mm,
right? And I don't think often nonprofit is looking at it like it's so hard to have some of these difficult conversations when we're all strapped, when we're all looking at culture and going, oh my goodness, we have to fix this, but we have no budget to figure out how to fix this. And so I do think nonprofit has some unique challenges that for profit
totally.
doesn't. No,
Yeah.
I'm not seeing the same things in the startup ecosystem in the same way, or they grow out of them faster, right, than nonprofits do.
Yeah, totally. And I feel like, gosh, we could go down so much. There's so much there in what you just said. And I don't like the reasons for why this is true, but nonprofit people are also just like the most resourceful people ever. I remember the first time I had like a for profit experience where they were like talking about budgets for something. And I was like, what are you talking about? Why on earth would that cost that much money to do? And just because I've been running organizations for years where I had watched people do unbelievable things and gather people and put on these tremendous events and all this. And I'm not saying we should not have more resources for those things. We totally should. But I feel like we don't even realize the gap between what we accomplish with so little and like everybody else out there. I even remember when COVID started and all these companies were filing for bankruptcy, like huge, big companies, right? After a few weeks or months or whatever, were filing for bankruptcy. And I was like, wait, why don't they have a 6 month reserve? Why
Yeah.
my entire nonprofit career has my board required a 6 month reserve? And these massive companies don't have to have that. They're just
Yeah.
all these standards that I think ultimately make us like incredible professionals for all the wrong reasons. But it does mean, I just think there's so much talent in this sector. These
Yeah.
are just the most amazing people.
Yeah, we need to own different titles for ourselves,
Mhm.
right? For sure. As innovators, as creatives. Challenges, I'd love to ask you because we're already moving into this challenges conversation. But I always feel like you are the most interesting mix of great humaning skills in fundraising and everything. And then on the reverse side, you're also a fundraising technology founder. You're with fundraising AI. And so it's almost like it's all been shoved into one person somehow, which I love because you don't fit in any camp exactly. Challenges for fundraisers right now. What are some of those big challenges you see across the fundraisers in the sector? I'll be specific just because that's your zone of genius.
Yeah. I think this probably applies to everybody right now too, but just like being in July of 2025, especially and being based in the US, although I think this is impacting nonprofits worldwide, the amount of consistent changes, updates, clawbacks to funding and to priorities in our country, in the US right now, is causing this like unbelievable stress, nervous system response that I think is making fundraisers feel understandably really scattered and uncertain about where they should focus, who they should talk to, what they should say about a certain thing or program. And I think the rapidness of those things coming at them with the underlying urgency around meeting their budget and just waiting for a moment that doesn't feel like quote unquote a bad time to fundraise is
Yeah.
just really overwhelming them, totally understandably. And I think that is creating some uncertainty and paralysis and fear globally in a fundraising landscape because the US is such a large portion of giving or like philanthropic giving in that way, and it's impacting federal grants but also what foundations are prioritizing, corporate partners, international relief. And then at the same time, the needs feel like they're growing exponentially too. And so as the needs grow, the need for additional funding grows, and fundraisers sit at that intersection of that. So I honestly think that's not like one kind of tiny challenge, but I think it's like, how do you fundraise in that climate? And trying to figure out what to say, when to say it, and who to say it to. Everybody is trying to figure out if that's different than what they would have said last month or 2 months ago or 6 months ago.
Then how do we find time, wild schedules we already have to make a plan, right? The thing is, and there's so many brilliant folks in the sector talking about vacancy rates, which we already know have been high at nonprofits and have really not gotten back to normal since COVID. But the expectations of what nonprofits can do, the gap they're filling, keeps increasing. And as government funding disappears for the actual services that organizations are running that are maybe government, nonprofits have never been more filling in
Totally.
gaps without the support they need too. I
Totally.
I keep looking at fundraisers and I know so many wonderful female fundraisers, women in the sector that are also momming. We talked about momming before we started on here. And people who have moved because of COVID who are now getting called back into office and have no idea how they're going to make that work because they
Mm.
were allowed remote work. I feel like fundraisers are in this very unique position right now in the sector, and you can just see a little bit of this crumbling a little bit, right? It does get me a little concerned about how fundraisers are going to adapt in the year ahead.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I talk about these days is stress response and our nervous system and how that relates to our experience and how we can show up every day and the actions that we take. And stress is supposed to end. Stress
Yeah,
is a really important part of our body's reaction. There are actually a lot of positive things that come from having a stress response to certain things. And we should have a stress response to certain things, right? There's
yeah,
nothing wrong about that, but stress has to end. That stress
yeah.
response cycle, we have to get our parasympathetic nervous system back online. And with everything that you just said, and we just get stuck in chronic stress. And then that's what leads to burnout. And I think that we have to solve for that, or we're in real big trouble.
We're in big trouble. So much of what we do at the Hive is focusing in on this idea of like peer networks and peer support. What does that look like for you in the sector when you were in-house and now as you're building out companies, as you're supporting other fundraisers?
Yeah, my background was in smaller grassroots organizations primarily. And so I was never somebody who knew about AFP or CFRE or the professional fundraising world. I was really lucky here in Northern California. There's a nonprofit center, a CVNL for volunteer leadership and nonprofits. So I had a great kind of like peer learning experiences through that. I was a part of a young ED Bay Area networking community that was so helpful when I was navigating. We would just go to coffee early morning, like 7 a.m. once a month or something like that. It was so lovely and so important. I still keep in touch with a number of those EDs. And a lot of them are still in house in the positions that they were in 10 years ago, which is amazing. And I think also a testament to that group of peer support that has walked with each other through all of this. I talk a lot about fundraising culture because I focus more on fundraising. We talk about the culture of philanthropy a lot in our sector, but I'm way more interested in the culture of fundraising. And what
Yeah.
I mean by that is, what does peer support look like inside your organization for fundraising? And I don't just mean that you're writing envelopes to help your fundraising peer out, but what are the ways that we talk about money in our organizations, whether we're a fundraiser or not? And how does that build a sense of peer support that we're all in this together? I think there's something just about knowing that you aren't. In my book, I talk about isolation and the role that isolation plays in chronic stress and burnout. And isolation isn't just like physical proximity, right? It's being seen, feeling like you belong, being a part of something. And all of that is so necessary. And we have to identify the things inside our organizations, inside our communities that are creating isolation, like mental isolation, almost an emotional isolation. And so much of what I think about with Activated, the company that I'm leading now, even though we are using generative AI to help simulate donor conversations and give feedback and do coaching in order to democratize professional development and training much more, I also am thinking about, as this platform grows and as our users grow, how do we start connecting people to each other? How do we
Mm.
create peer community within the organizations? We have a 75-person university inside the system with a fundraising team. How are they being intentionally connected to each other to know, hey, here's an area you've been struggling in. Your peer over at this other college is actually really good at that. You guys should meet up for 30 minutes so they can talk to you about how they do that in donor meetings. And so I've been thinking a lot about within the organizations we have in the platform, but also I just introduced two EDs the other day who are both inside Practivated. One of them has resolved a challenge that the other is now facing and that we know from onboarding. And we are like, hey, the two of you should meet. And so it has some great things. I love what you're doing with the Hive. And I feel it's so important to just be creating intentional spaces. That's what I love so much about the Hive, what you talk about and the resources that you provide. It's not actually just about being in the same place or showing up to the same Zoom call. It's what is the intentional way in which we are building actual community through our actions and behaviors and routines.
What's funny about community is there's that consistency and there's rituals to community. And that's what kind of creates then belonging over here. And that's what's really hard is like you can gather people from similar backgrounds, similar workplaces or whatever, but like creating that
Mm,
place where it's like, oh, this is what you're coming for. Like you said, intention is enormous. It's great if you have a team that you're working with. Fundraising is funny. I've worked in sales in the past and everything. It can be a really supportive place if that's the culture, or it can be a very competitive place if
mhm.
that's the culture too, right? And how do we create those internal cultures for fundraisers? Or maybe you're like the lone fundraiser and no one else in fundraising. And then that's another whole vibe completely, right? So tell us a little bit more. I would love to have you explain a little bit more the dream behind Practivated, because not only it's new, it's just starting to get there, but what's the dream? What did you see? How did this come into being?
I'm such a like one foot in front of the other person. Sometimes I have crazy big wild ideas, but honestly, Practivated started as just me trying to solve a problem with the folks inside my program Power Partners and the Alignment Fundraising Collective that I hadn't been able to solve. I felt I've been for the last 5 years building habits and coaching tools and workshops and trainings to help fundraisers build confidence and become more aligned and embodied versions of themselves when they raise money, put together plans, and then ultimately talk to donors. And the one piece I felt like I couldn't solve for was that like donor meeting conversation. I couldn't be with all of my clients or everybody
Yeah.
in my programs like right before they were going into a meeting, or to help to talk about every single donor or prospect they wanted to have a conversation with. And I wanted to solve that for them because a few years ago, I sent an email out to my email list asking how many more donor meetings people wanted to have a week. And the number one most common answer was one. The second most common answer was zero.
It's crazy.
And this is across, at the time, maybe 12,000 people on my list. There are thousands of responses, and I couldn't get over that. And I have been sort of obsessing about that for years. What is holding fundraisers back from even wanting those meetings? Now, you could easily say that it's too much on their calendar, their plates are already full, but all of these people want to raise more money, right? Otherwise, why are you on my email list?
Yeah.
And don't want to have more donor meetings. And that those two things are incompatible. So
Yeah.
I was like, we have to change that. And I think part of that for me creating Practivated, which are these, as I was saying, AI generated donor avatar conversations where you can prepare for a specific meeting, but you can also just go into practice scenarios and build skills, and you get feedback across 16 different indicators. And then you can activate our coach who will coach you around how to improve those areas. We had somebody do a 31-minute coaching session yesterday after a 5-minute simulation, 7-minute simulation, I think, about how to improve their structure, flow, and transitions of meetings. And I just saw the timestamp come up and then reached out because I was like, oh my gosh, whoa. And it was just incredible because she got to learn what was actually in a more concrete way. So many of us leave a donor meeting and we're like, oh, I did a bad job, or I really messed that up, or that didn't go as planned. But we don't actually talk about why, because there's also probably a lot of things that went really well in that meeting, but we're obsessing about the one thing that didn't go well that sort of tainted the whole thing. So getting scored on 16 things, seeing all the things you're doing great, but then saying, okay, actually the reason that felt messy was because of this one, was because your structure, flow, and transitions were not there. And so then
Yeah.
work with a coach to strengthen that one area, and then the pieces fall together. Somebody asked me the other day, what's your end goal with Practivated? And I said, to change fundraising forever. I want my North Star to improve the lives of fundraisers and nonprofit leaders. That's it. At the end of the day, that's all I want. I've been trying to do that through a variety of ways for the last 5 years. And Practivated is the most sort of scalable, impactful, life-changing way that I've been able to discover. And that's why I'm going all in on it.
I think it creates like the biggest thing that stands out to me, and this was part of what our feedback has also been from these Hive chats that we've been helping. It is a safe space, and safe spaces are really hard in nonprofit, right? The ability to go, and I know we have Tim Lockey in common as a friend. When Tim has often talked about feelings of incompetence, when people feel incompetent, they have a very big reaction to that. And you don't want to put yourself out there. There's the rare person who's like, I feel incompetent. I'm going to double down. That's
Mm,
especially when we're overwhelmed. We
mm,
just back it up, right? So I think
mm.
it's such a cool tool, but it's also just of the use cases for AI that I've heard of in this sector, it's not the automation piece that we hear about so frequently that is like, no, you shouldn't be getting rid of relationships. You should be figuring out how to make better relationships, right? And so I think you just hit on something. It's so beautiful. I love it, Mallory.
Thank you. I think that, and I feel this way about the Hive too, that I just want to say, I feel like for so long, it was this like human or technology conversation, right? Are you going to
Yeah.
tech forward or human tech centered or human centered or whatever? And I think this growing like human centered technology is the way. It's Activated is about helping fundraisers build more connected, aligned relationships with real donors, right? That
Yeah.
the point. How do we have the ability to actually physically, biologically, cognitively connect with other people? And how do we build that ability? And then for what you're doing too, it's like exactly that. How do you use technology actually to bring people together in meaningful ways? And I want to see more of that. I want to see more of technology helping to build and create and bring people together.
That's perfect. So how can people follow up with what you're doing? You've got a podcast, you've got a book, you've got courses, you've got Practivated now. How can people follow along with what you're doing and where should they head?
So you can Connect with me on LinkedIn, Mallory Erickson. I'm sure we'll have a link somewhere where I tend to be the most active social media wise and drop a number of different references. If you join my newsletter at malloryerickson.com, you'll hear about speaking and what the fundraising podcast episodes and things like that. And then practivated.com. Go check it out, see what it's all about. We have some really exciting announcements coming soon. So if you subscribe over there too, you'll be the first to hear and have an opportunity to check it out in our next wave.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for doing this with me. It's always lovely to chat with you.
Thank you for having me. This was so nice.